You have 48 hours to remove the unapproved statuary, or the daily fines will commence. The clock is ticking, Mr. Henderson. Her name was Brenda Miller, and she was the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. She stood on my porch, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her posture a rigid monument to petty authority. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the small ceramic garden gnome standing sentinel next to my prize-winning azaleas. His name was General Sherman. He wore a blue coat, held a small fishing pole, and had a look of quiet contentment on his face. To Brenda, he was a declaration of war. I looked from the gnome to her face, a mask of smug certainty. The afternoon sun caught the synthetic sheen of her heavily sprayed blonde hair, creating a halo effect that was profoundly undeserved. She thought this was a simple transaction. She, the enforcer, delivering an ultimatum to me, the compliant resident. It was a power play she had run 100 times on my neighbors, and it had always worked. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My expression remained neutral. My heart rate was steady. In my previous life, I'd had men with actual weapons and genuine malice screaming threats in languages I didn't understand. Brenda Miller and her clipboard barely registered as a blip on my threat assessment matrix. Unapproved statuary, I repeated, my voice calm and even. Could you please cite the specific article and section of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that defines statuary and provides a list of pre-approved designs? Her smile faltered for a microsecond. It was the first flicker of confusion. The peasants weren't supposed to ask for citations. They were supposed to cringe, apologize, and obey. It's in the bylaws, she snapped, recovering. Section C, paragraph 4, aesthetic harmony. I have a copy of the CC&Rs right here, I said, gesturing to the small table by my door. I'd had it there for a week, ever since I saw her terrorizing Mrs. Gable over the color of her welcome mat. Section C, paragraph 4, pertains to the erection of sheds and permanent outbuildings. It says nothing about decorative items under 24 inches in height. General Sherman, for the record, is a proud 18 inches. Brenda's face began its fascinating journey through the color spectrum, starting with a pale pink of annoyance. It's the spirit of the rule, she insisted, her voice rising. We can't have people's tacky lawn junk cluttering up the neighborhood. It lowers property values. Does it? I asked, my tone one of genuine curiosity. Because the Zillow estimate for your house has dropped 3% since you painted your shutters that vibrant shade of teal. My property value, meanwhile, is up 4% year over year. Perhaps the general is a good luck charm. This was a direct hit. The teal shutters were her pride and joy, a choice she had personally rammed through the Architectural Review Committee, which she also chaired. The pink on her cheeks deepened to a blotchy crimson. She was losing control of the engagement, and she knew it. This is your official warning, she seethed, thrusting the clipboard at me. The fines start Thursday, $50 a day, and they will accumulate. We will put a lien on your house, Mr. Henderson. We will foreclose. Don't test me. I took the paper from her. I didn't look at it. My eyes remained locked on hers. I gave her a small, thin smile that didn't reach them. Brenda, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost conspiratorial level. You have made a grave tactical error. She stared at me, momentarily speechless. The sheer, calm certainty in my voice was something her programming couldn't compute. She was expecting fear, or anger, or capitulation. She received none of it. All she got was a promise of methodical, devastating consequences. She finally found her voice, a shrill squawk. Are you threatening me? No, I replied, folding the violation notice neatly into a perfect square. I'm giving you a piece of free intelligence. You've initiated a conflict without conducting proper reconnaissance on your target. You've assumed I'm like everyone else you've bullied. You've assumed you hold all the power. These are rookie mistakes. In my line of work, they're the kind of mistakes that get people hurt. She backed away a step, her mask of authority cracking to reveal the insecure petty tyrant beneath. She puffed out her chest. We'll see who's making a mistake when you're getting an eviction notice. She turned and marched down my walkway, her back ramrod straight. I watched her go. She thought she was laying siege to my castle. She had no idea she was marching her entire army into a kill box of her own design. This wasn't about a garden gnome anymore. This was about restoring order. She had declared war, and my war-fighting doctrine was simple: overwhelming and disproportionate force. The file on Brenda Miller and the Westgate Meadows HOA was now officially open. The first phase of any campaign is intelligence gathering. Before you plan your offensive, you must understand the terrain, the enemy's strength, their weaknesses, and their command structure. For the next week, I became a ghost. I dedicated my days to building a comprehensive dossier. My home office, once a quiet sanctuary for reading and retirement, transformed into a command and control center. I started with the documents, the HOA's CC and Rs, bylaws, articles of incorporation, and meeting minutes for the past 5 years. I requested them through a formal, certified letter citing the relevant state statutes that guaranteed homeowners access. The initial response was a dismissive email from Brenda stating the documents were for board members only. This was her second mistake. A second certified letter, this one with the relevant statute highlighted in a gentle mention of the State Attorney General's office, produced the documents within 48 hours. They arrived in a disorganized cardboard box, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm and dissuade. It was amateur hour. For a man who spent 3 years in a windowless room in Kandahar, sifting through mountains of signal intelligence to find actionable patterns, this was a vacation. I spent the next 72 hours fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering anger. I scanned every single page, creating a searchable digital archive. I cross-referenced every line item in the budget with the corresponding meeting minutes. I built a spreadsheet so complex it would have made a CPA weep. Patterns began to emerge. Small ones at first, then larger, more troubling connections. The landscaping contract, for instance, it had been awarded 3 years ago, without a competitive bid, to a company called Prestige Scapes LLC. The cost was 30% higher than the previous contractors. The meeting minutes showed Brenda herself had pushed it through, citing a need for a more professional look. A quick search of state business records revealed Prestige Scapes LLC was registered to a Mr. Robert Donahue. A little more digging on social media, a surprisingly effective open-source intelligence tool, revealed that Robert Donahue was Brenda Miller's brother-in-law. It was a classic, grubby case of self-dealing. The contract was worth over $100,000 a year. That was the community's money, being funneled directly into her family's pockets. This wasn't just a violation of HOA bylaws regarding conflicts of interest. This was wire fraud. They communicated via email, and the payments were made via electronic bank transfers across state lines, as the LLC was registered in the neighboring state. That put it squarely in federal jurisdiction. I created a new tab in my spreadsheet. File B, Criminal Conspiracy. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry board member or a petty bureaucrat who thinks the rules don't apply to them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You are going to want to see how this meticulously constructed fortress of corruption gets dismantled brick by fraudulent brick. Drop a comment and let me know what kind of tyrant you've had to deal with. My investigation deepened. I examined the series of special assessments levied over the past 2 years. One for repaving the community roads, one for a new clubhouse roof, one for upgrading the pool filtration system. The total came to nearly $500,000 levied on homeowners who were already struggling. In each case, the contracts were awarded without a transparent bidding process. In each case, the vendor was a newly formed LLC with opaque ownership. And in each case, the final cost was significantly higher than industry standard. I started mapping the connections. The paving company was owned by a man who was the best man at Robert Donahue's wedding. The roofing company's registered agent was a cousin. It was a web of nepotism and kickbacks, all orchestrated by Queen Brenda, who sat at the center, enriching her family and herself on the backs of her neighbors. She wasn't just a bully, she was a thief, cloaked in the cheap fabric of HOA authority. While the paper trail was damning, I needed human intelligence to complete the picture. I needed to know the effect her reign of terror was having on the community. It was time to move from reconnaissance to building a resistance network. My first visit was to Mrs. Gable, a sweet woman in her late 70s who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Brenda had been harassing her for months about a non-compliant wreath on her door. It was a seasonal wreath, for crying out loud. I found her tending her roses, her shoulders slumped. I introduced myself and explained that I was having my own issues with the HOA. Her story came tumbling out, a torrent of frustration and fear. The constant letters, the threats of fines, the public shaming at the last community meeting where Brenda had called her decorations gaudy. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her eyes welling up. "This has been my home for 40 years. Now I feel like I'm trespassing." "You're not trespassing, Eleanor," I said gently. "You're being targeted, and you're not alone. I want you to write down every single interaction you've had. Dates, times, what was said. Find any letters she sent you. I'm putting together a file." I gave her a simple template for recording incidents and a promise to check in with her. I left her with a flicker of hope in her eyes, the first she'd had in months. That flicker was the seed of an insurgency. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically and discreetly visited a dozen other homeowners. The stories were all variations on the same theme. There was the young couple, the Patels, fined because their children's sidewalk chalk art was deemed graffiti. There was Mr. Chen, a retired mechanic, cited for working on his classic car in his own closed garage because Brenda heard mechanical noises. There was the Rodriguez family, who were denied permission to build a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son because it didn't fit the aesthetic harmony of the community. Each story was a fresh log on the fire of my cold, controlled fury. Brenda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was systematically targeting the vulnerable, the quiet, and anyone who didn't fit her narrow, sterile vision of a perfect suburb. Each person I spoke to was isolated, afraid, and convinced they were the only ones. I showed them they were not. I taught them the art of documentation. Certified mail is your best friend, I explained in a quiet meeting I hosted in my living room for my new recruits. It creates a legal paper trail. Emails can be deleted. A signed receipt from the post office cannot. Record every conversation. Your phone has a voice memo app. Check the state laws. We're a one-party consent state, which means as long as you are part of the conversation, you can legally record it. Never engage with her verbally without your recorder running. She uses ambiguity and intimidation. We will use clarity and evidence. We became a small, clandestine cell of resistance. We shared information through an encrypted messaging app. We compiled a shared database of Brenda's abuses, complete with scanned letters, photographs, and audio recordings. The fear that had held the community hostage began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of solidarity and purpose. They saw I had a plan, a strategy, and they began to trust it. Meanwhile, the daily fines against me for General Sherman's continued presence were piling up. The letters arrived like clockwork, each one more threatening than the last. I cataloged them all in File A, the Nome Offensive. Brenda was so focused on her frontal assault that she remained completely oblivious to the flanking maneuver that was about to obsolete her entire position. She thought she was fighting a battle over a lawn ornament. I was preparing to dismantle her entire criminal enterprise, and she still had no idea about my ace in the hole. The one piece of leverage so powerful, so absolute, that it would render all of her pathetic threats meaningless. It was time to review the details of the Westgate Meadows ground lease, a document that hadn't been looked at in decades, a document whose beneficiary was a quiet, unassuming LLC I had inherited from my father. A document that made me, in a very real sense, Brenda's landlord. My father was a shrewd man. A real estate developer from the old school, he believed in long-term assets, not quick flips. When he and his partners developed Westgate Meadows back in the late 1970s, they structured the deal in a unique way. They sold the houses and the lots they sat on, but they retained ownership of the common areas, the green belts, the walking paths, and the prime parcel of land where the community clubhouse, pool, and tennis courts now stood. They leased that land back to the newly formed Homeowners Association on a 99-year ground lease. The annual payment was nominal, just a few $1,000s, set at the time and with only modest cost of living increases built in. For the HOA, it was a fantastic deal. For my father, it was a small but incredibly stable annuity, an asset that would exist in perpetuity. When he passed away, that asset, held within a family trust and managed by an anonymous-sounding LLC, passed to me. The HOA board, through years of turnover and institutional memory loss, likely had no idea about the specifics. They saw the annual payment in their budget, a line item labeled Common Area Lease, and paid it without a second thought. They didn't know who was on the other end of that transaction. They didn't know that the lease contained clauses, standard for commercial leases but devastating in this context, giving the landlord significant rights. Rights of inspection, rights to approve or deny any major alterations to the property, and most importantly, the right to declare the tenant, in this case the entire HOA, in default for breach of contract. Breaches could include not just non-payment, but failure to maintain the property, illegal activities conducted on the premises, or actions that jeopardize the value and integrity of the asset. Actions like, for instance, a board of directors engaging in systemic financial fraud. Brenda Miller thought she was trying to foreclose on my home. In reality, she was the tenant in a building I ultimately controlled, and she was actively violating the terms of her lease. The irony was so rich it was almost poetic. She had spent years wielding the HOA's power like a cudgel, never realizing that the very ground beneath her throne didn't actually belong to her. With my intelligence gathered and my local resistance cell organized, it was time to move to the next phase, legal engagement. I wasn't going to fight Brenda on her turf. I wasn't going to argue about gnomes in an HOA kangaroo court. I was going to escalate the conflict to a level she couldn't comprehend. Through a contact from my days in the service, I was introduced to a lawyer named Marcus Thorne, a retired colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Marcus had spent 20 years prosecuting military contractors for fraud in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was now in private practice, and he had a deep, abiding hatred for bullies and grifters. When I laid out my files, the spreadsheet detailing the kickbacks, the audio recordings, the notarized statements from other residents, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a textbook RICO case hiding in a cul-de-sac. What's your desired end state, Henderson?" The military phrasing was comforting. "Complete removal of the current board," I replied. "Forensic audit of the last 5 years of financials. Civil action to recover all misappropriated funds. Criminal charges filed against Miller and her co-conspirators. And I want to ensure a structure is put in place so this can never happen again." "And the gnome?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. "The gnome stays," I said. "That's non-negotiable." Marcus laughed, a deep booming sound. "I like it. A clear, achievable objective with a symbolic victory condition? Let's get to work." Our first move was a carefully calibrated two-pronged attack. The first prong was a direct response to Brenda's threats. Marcus drafted a letter that was a masterpiece of legal devastation. It was addressed to the HOA board via their registered agent. It systematically dismantled the legal basis for the fines and the lien threat. It cited the specific language of the CC&RS, state statutes on HOA powers, and federal fair housing laws, which Brenda was likely violating by selectively harassing elderly and minority residents. The letter formally demanded the immediate removal of all fines, a written retraction of the foreclosure threat, and a formal apology. It concluded by stating that any further attempt to enforce these illegal fines would be met with a lawsuit for harassment, seeking both compensatory and punitive damages. We sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. The second prong was more subtle. It was a Trojan horse. From the LLC that held the ground lease, Marcus sent a separate, exceptionally polite letter to the HOA board. It was addressed to the current property manager. The letter stated that, as part of a routine periodic review of its assets, the landlord required a copy of the HOA's current liability insurance policy for the clubhouse and pool area, as stipulated in Section 7, Paragraph B of the ground lease agreement. It also politely inquired about any major capital improvements made to the property in the last 24 months, a right of inquiry granted to the landlord in Section 9. This letter was designed to do two things. First, it would force them to dig up the lease and confront the reality of their landlord-tenant relationship. Second, it would serve as a range-finding shot. Their response would tell us how much they knew, or more likely, how much they didn't. It was a quiet knock on the door before we kicked it down. Brenda received both letters on the same Tuesday afternoon. I knew because I watched the mail carrier get her signature from my front window. Her reaction to the first letter was predictable. That evening, a furious, all-caps email was sent out to the entire community, decrying the frivolous legal threats from a disgruntled resident and vowing that the board would not be intimidated. She was trying to rally public opinion against me. It was a classic move for a cornered tyrant. Her reaction to the second letter, the one from the LLC, was far more telling. It was silence. For 3 days, there was no response. This confirmed my primary hypothesis. She had no idea. She likely saw the letter, noted the unfamiliar LLC name, and dismissed it as some bureaucratic nuisance, probably tossing it in a pile to be ignored. She failed to make the connection. She failed to understand its significance. This was her fatal mistake. While she was busy raging against my lawyer's letter, she was ignoring the one that held the key to her entire kingdom. She was focused on the soldier at the gate, unaware that the castle's foundations were about to be dissolved beneath her. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It would be the perfect venue for the final act. The 3 weeks leading up to the annual meeting were a period of intense, quiet preparation. On the surface, the neighborhood was calm, but beneath it, our network was buzzing. We used the time to consolidate our evidence and choreograph our moves for the meeting. Marcus and I prepared a comprehensive presentation that would lay out Brenda's malfeasance in excruciating, undeniable detail. We compiled financial charts, timelines of contracts awarded to her family, and anonymized but powerful quotes from the residents she had victimized. Simultaneously, we prepared the nuclear option. Marcus drafted a formal notice of default on the ground lease. It was a brutal document. It cited multiple material breaches. Breach 1, financial mismanagement and suspected illegal activity. The lease required the tenant to operate in a lawful manner. Racketeering and fraud were clear violations. Breach 2, unauthorized capital improvements. Her new roof and the road paving, undertaken without consulting or even notifying the landlord as required by the lease, were direct violations of the property alteration clauses. The notice gave the HOA 30 days to cure the default. The cure was not simple. It required the immediate resignation of the entire board, the appointment of an independent receiver to manage the HOA's affairs, full cooperation with a forensic audit to be conducted by a firm of our choosing, and the initiation of civil proceedings to recover all misappropriated funds from Brenda and her associates. If these conditions were not met within 30 days, the landlord would exercise its right to terminate the lease and begin eviction proceedings. They would be evicted from their own clubhouse. This document remained our ace in the hole, ready to be deployed at the moment of maximum impact. Brenda, meanwhile, was doubling down. Blinded by arrogance, she interpreted our relative silence as a sign of weakness. She saw my lawyer's letter as a bluff. She ramped up her harassment campaign, plastering a notice of lien on my front door, a legally meaningless but visually intimidating document. It was pure theater, designed to scare me and signal to the neighborhood that she was still in charge. I took a photo of it, added it to the evidence file, and took it down. She also made it clear that the annual meeting would be her stage. The agenda she circulated had a special item listed: action on delinquent homeowner accounts and enforcement proceedings. That was me. That was my public execution. She planned to use the meeting to humiliate me, to get the community to vote in favor of foreclosing on my home over a few $1,000s in trumped-up fines for a garden gnome. She was playing checkers, convinced she was about to take my king, while I was playing a level of chess she couldn't even perceive. The night of the meeting arrived. The clubhouse community room was packed, more so than any meeting in recent memory. Brenda had whipped up her supporters, a small clique of homeowners who benefited from her reign or simply enjoyed the drama. But our side was there in force, too. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, a look of quiet resolve on her face. The Patels, Mr. Chen, the Rodriguez family, and a dozen others were scattered throughout the room, a silent, unified block. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, a simpering accountant named Gary and a perpetually confused woman named Carol. Brenda was radiant with smug power. She was wearing a bright red blazer, a power color, and her smile was sharp and predatory. She opened the meeting with the usual formalities, her voice dripping with condescension. Finally, she arrived at my agenda item. "And now," she announced, her voice ringing with theatrical gravity, We must address the unfortunate business of a homeowner who refuses to comply with our community's standards. She locked her eyes on me. Mr. Henderson, your account is now over $3,000 in arrears due to unpaid fines. The board has voted to initiate foreclosure proceedings. We are bringing this to the community tonight to be transparent about the actions we are forced to take to protect our collective property values. A murmur went through the room. This was it, her moment of triumph. I stood up slowly. I was holding a small USB drive in my hand. Brenda, I said, my voice calm and carrying easily through the silent room. Before the community entertains this ridiculous motion, I have a short presentation I'd like to share. It concerns the board's fiduciary responsibilities. She scoffed. You are out of order. This is not your time to speak. I believe it is, I said, walking toward the front of the room where a projector was set up. And I believe every homeowner here who has paid their dues and special assessments will find it very, very relevant. Before she could stop me, I plugged the drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The first slide illuminated the screen behind her. It was a simple title: An Examination of Westgate Meadows HOA Financials, 2018 to 2023. Brenda's face went from crimson to a chalky white. Turn that off, she shrieked at Gary. But it was too late. I had the remote in my hand. I clicked to the next slide. It was an organizational chart. On one side was the HOA board. On the other were the LLCs for Prestige Scapes, the paving company, and the roofer. Lines connected Brenda's name to her brother-in-law, and from there to the other cronies. It was a conspiracy map, clear as day. As you can see, I began, my voice methodical and clear, like a professor giving a lecture. The board has awarded over $800,000 in no-bid contracts over the past 5 years. Curiously, all of these contracts have been awarded to companies owned by or directly connected to the family and close friends of our board president, Brenda Miller. Gasps rippled through the room. People were turning to stare at Brenda, who looked like she had been struck by lightning. I clicked again. The next slide showed the invoice for the landscaping services from Prestige Scapes LLC, next to a quote for the same services from the company who had held the contract previously. The difference was over $30,000 a year. This is the Brenda bonus, I stated coldly. A 30% markup paid for by you, the homeowners, that goes directly into her family's pockets. I went on, slide after devastating slide. The inflated paving contract, the exorbitant roofing bill. I showed them the state business filings. I showed them the social media photos of Brenda on vacation with the very contractors who were supposedly chosen through an impartial process. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and sourced entirely from public records and the HOA's own documents. The mood in the room had shifted from a tense public shaming to a full-blown populist revolt. People were shouting questions at the board table. Is this true, Brenda? Did you steal our money? Brenda, recovering some of her bluster, banged her gavel. These are lies, fabrications from a disgruntled resident trying to avoid paying his fines. Are they? I asked, my voice cutting through the noise. I clicked to the final slide of this section. It was a bank statement leaked to me by a conscience-stricken former board member, showing a $50,000 payment from the roofing company directly into Brenda's personal savings account, 2 days after the HOA paid their final invoice. The memo line read, consulting fee. The room erupted. Gary, the accountant, looked like he was about to faint. Carol was openly weeping. Brenda was sputtering, her lies crumbling under the weight of the documented proof. This is illegal, someone shouted from the back. Yes, it is, I agreed. It is likely wire fraud, mail fraud, and tax evasion. A copy of this presentation has already been delivered to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. That revelation sucked the remaining air out of the room. But I wasn't finished. This was just the groundwork. It was time to deliver the killing blow. But the board's criminal activity is, in some ways, a secondary issue for tonight, I continued, my voice dropping. There is a more fundamental problem, a problem of tenancy. I clicked the remote one last time. A new image appeared on the screen. It was a scanned copy of a deed, a title document. The legal description clearly outlined the parcel of land upon which the clubhouse, the pool, and the tennis courts were built. At the bottom, under owner, was the name of a familiar-sounding entity, the same LLC that had sent Brenda the polite, ignored letter a few weeks prior. Some of you may not be aware, I said, addressing the stunned homeowners, but the HOA does not actually own the land this building sits on. It operates on a 99-year ground lease, signed in 1978. I let that sink in. I turned my attention back to the pale, trembling woman at the head table. Brenda, a few weeks ago, my company sent you a letter. You ignored it. In that letter, we requested information about capital improvements. Under the terms of the lease, any major alteration to this property requires the landlord's written consent. The $500,000 you spent on paving and roofing, money you largely funneled to your family, was a capital improvement. You never sought our consent. You never even notified us. That is a material breach of the lease agreement. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I walked to the head table and placed it squarely in front of her. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't touch it. This, I announced to the room, is a formal notice of default. The HOA is in violation of its lease. The terms to cure this default are outlined within. They include the immediate resignation of the entire board, full cooperation with a forensic audit, and the repayment of all misappropriated funds. You have 30 days. I paused, letting the full weight of the situation settle over her. And if the default is not cured in 30 days, I finished, my voice as cold and hard as granite, my company will have no choice but to terminate the lease and begin eviction proceedings. You will be foreclosed on, not me. The silence that followed was absolute. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been inverted, shattered, and remade. Brenda, the queen, the tyrant, was suddenly nothing more than a defaulting tenant, about to be thrown out of a building she thought she ruled. Her face was a ruin of collapsed arrogance. And just at that moment, as if on cue, the double doors at the back of the community room swung open. 2 men and a woman entered. They were dressed in conservative business attire, but they moved with an economy of motion and a quiet authority that instantly commanded attention. They were not homeowners. Their eyes scanned the room, settling on the chaotic scene at the head table. The lead man, tall and with graying temples, held up a badge. "Brenda Miller?" he asked, his voice calm but brooking no argument. "I'm Special Agent Davies with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We have a warrant to seize all financial records of the Westgate Meadows HOA. We also have a warrant for your arrest." The final beautiful, systematic destruction of Brenda's empire had begun. The chaos that ensued was a sight to behold. As the federal agents calmly and professionally placed Brenda in handcuffs, reading her Miranda rights in a dispassionate monotone, her carefully constructed world imploded. Her 2 sycophant board members, Gary and Carol, seemed to shrink in their seats trying to become invisible. It wouldn't work. The agents had warrants for their records as well, and it was clear they were at best material witnesses and at worst unindicted co-conspirators. Brenda did not go quietly. The shock gave way to a sputtering, incoherent rage. She shrieked about her rights, about this being a misunderstanding, about me being some kind of monster who had framed her. It was a pathetic, undignified spectacle, and it only served to cement her guilt in the eyes of every homeowner present. They watched, stone-faced, as the woman who had terrorized them over lawn ornaments and welcome mats was led away in disgrace, her reign ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic click of handcuffs. The agents were models of efficiency. They took possession of the HOA's laptops, filing cabinets, and boxes of records. They were polite but firm, their presence a stark contrast to Brenda's theatrical and illegitimate authority. They represented real power, institutional power, the kind that Brenda had only ever pretended to have. In the aftermath, the community was in a state of shock, but it was a cathartic shock. As the federal vehicles pulled away, a spontaneous applause broke out. It started with Mrs. Gable, a single defiant clap, and then it spread through the room. It was a sound of liberation. People were turning to each other, smiling, talking with neighbors they had been too intimidated to speak to for years. The spell of fear was broken. Marcus Thorne, who had been observing quietly from the back, stepped forward to help manage the situation. An emergency meeting was called on the spot. By a unanimous vote of the homeowners present, a temporary oversight committee was established. I was asked to chair it, but I declined. My objective was complete. I had no desire to be the new Brenda. Instead, I nominated Mr. Chen, the retired mechanic, a man of quiet integrity and common sense. He was elected by acclamation, along with the Patels and two other residents known for their fairness. Their mandate was simple: cooperate fully with the federal investigation and begin the process of rebuilding our community. The following months were a methodical process of decontamination. The forensic audit I had initiated through the ground lease default notice uncovered the full extent of the rot. Brenda and her brother-in-law had embezzled nearly $1.2 million over 6 years. It was a far more extensive criminal enterprise than even I had initially suspected. The audit report became key evidence in the federal case against them. We used the report to file a massive civil lawsuit against Brenda, her husband, her brother-in-law, and all their shell companies. We went after everything. We put liens on their homes, their cars, and their bank accounts. Marcus Thorne was relentless, a legal pit bull who took immense professional satisfaction in clawing back every single stolen dollar on behalf of the community. The legal process grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly fine. A year after that fateful meeting, Brenda Miller, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 51 months in a federal penitentiary. Her brother-in-law received a similar sentence. They were ordered to pay full restitution. The civil suit was successful, and we managed to recover almost 90 cents on the dollar, a remarkable achievement. The money was returned to the HOA's coffers. The new board, led by Mr. Chen, used it wisely. They repaved the roads properly, this time with a reputable company chosen through a transparent bidding process that came in at 40% less than Brenda's crony. They repaired the clubhouse roof and invested in the community's landscaping. They established new transparent bylaws with strict term limits for board members and robust conflict of interest rules. The culture of the neighborhood transformed. The sidewalk chalk art returned. Mrs. Gable's door was adorned with the most magnificent, gaudy wreaths imaginable, changing with every season. The Rodriguez family got their wheelchair ramp, built by community volunteers in a single weekend. People started talking to each other again. Block parties were organized. The oppressive atmosphere of suspicion and fear was replaced by a genuine sense of community. As for the ground lease, the new board formally acknowledged the default and worked with me to cure it. They were grateful. They understood that the lease in my hands had been the tool that saved them. We drafted a new addendum to the lease, one that provided even stronger protections for the homeowners against future board malfeasance. The annual lease payment check now arrives on time, every time, with a handwritten thank you note from the board treasurer. I never did remove General Sherman. He still stands proudly by my azaleas, his fishing pole glinting in the sun. He has become something of a neighborhood mascot, a silent symbol of quiet defiance. Sometimes new residents will ask about the story, and the older ones will tell them about the night the queen was overthrown by a man with a garden gnome and a deep understanding of contract law. Justice isn't always a thunderous lightning bolt. Sometimes it's a meticulously organized spreadsheet. Sometimes it's a certified letter. Sometimes it's the quiet, patient accumulation of facts, deployed with tactical precision at the decisive moment. Brenda Miller tried to take my home because she didn't like my gnome. In the end, I took her freedom, her money, and her power, not with force, but with a better prepared case file. And my property values, I'm happy to report, have never been higher. The peace and quiet I retired to enjoy has been fully restored, earned not by avoiding a conflict, but by prosecuting it to its absolute and logical conclusion.